Deaddrawgaming. Like no one ever was.
What's up, Dead Drawers? My name is Cory. I'm a member of Team DDG, and I'm coming at you today with some analysis from the Collinsville, Illinois, or St. Louis Regional Championship that we just had a couple weeks ago, looking at some of the decks, some of the meta trends that came out of that tournament, and trying to give you some insight as to maybe what we should be thinking about as it relates to Charlotte, which is coming up in a few weeks, and also some League Cups. A lot of the content that you're going to see out there is really centered around Expanded right now, seeing as we've got Costa Mesa coming up, first weekend of March. I'm not personally going to Costa Mesa, so my mind is on Standard. That's what I'm going to be playing for Cups over the course of March, and also what we're going to be doing for Charlotte. So if you're looking for some Standard analysis, you're in the right place. I want to start by going over the day one meta share that each of these decks represented. So this came out from Arcanine Labs. They were able to use their online deck list tool to do some analysis and bring to light what decks did people bring on day one to Collinsville, and we can also then look at what made day two and do some analysis there. So the first thing I would say is the top three decks. So of the field of about 1,050 players, the top three decks were Buzzwole Lycanroc, Magnezone with Duskmane Necrozma presumably, and Tapu Bulu Vikavolt. So what's interesting to see here is that the top three decks, so about 25 to 30% of the meta, about 250 to 300 people brought decks that focus on early game pressure, one-hit knockouts, and frankly, there's also a higher variability in these decks because you're relying on things like Max Elixir, rare candies into stage 2s early in the game. So a lot of players kind of chose to go with these decks that you kind of have to draw into your cards a little more. I think that's something we need to take note of, something that we need to keep on our radar, that a good amount of the player base is looking at these decks as fast, aggressive decks. They have a higher tendency, in my opinion, to not perform as expected. Sometimes you just don't hit turn 2 Vikavolt. Sometimes you just don't hit Magnezone. It's very difficult to mitigate those situations. But a lot of the player base is looking at that and saying, I understand the risk, I'm going to play with these decks anyway. Then we get into a lot of the other decks that we saw, namely Garbodor variants and Zoroark variants. So bringing up the rest of the field, we had Espeon Garb and Garbodor variants. About 130 players played some version of Garbodor. And then Zoroark variants, about another 150 to 200 players played some sort of Zoroark variant. If you just lump Golisopod Zoroark, Lycanroc Zoroark, and Gardevoir, Glaceon Zoroark, Zoroark Garb even had 20-25 people playing it. So definitely a high share of the meta going to a few archetypes. Fast pressure, one-hit KOs, Buzzwole Lycanroc, Magnezone, Bulu Vikavolt, some sort of ability lock like Garbodor or a Zoroark variant. So that really seems to be where the meta is kind of starting to solidify itself. But the other thing I would add is that the meta is really dynamic right now. There's a lot of decks out there. You could easily walk into a League Cup and face one of these Hoopa Mill decks, a Passimian deck, a Dugtrio deck, a Xerneas Break deck. So the meta is in an interesting spot where there's a lot of decks to choose from, and there's a lot of decks that can do well. So now that we've looked at day one, let's look at the conversion rate. So when you think about conversion rate, here's the way to think about this. What percentage of players who brought a certain deck made their way to top 64? I just use top 64 as a proxy to sort of proxy day two. Of course, about 20 of those people didn't make day two, but to get a bigger sample size of the decks that essentially did well, we're going to look at the top 64 conversion rate. So the way to think about this is, let's take the first deck, Buzzwole Lycanroc. About 130 people took Buzzwole Lycanroc. What percentage of those players made day two? So the one thing to realize here is that, sometimes you have a small sample size, so it skews the results a little bit. I'll give you an example. Raichu and Sylveon. If we go back to our first slide, let's see, there was... How many Sylveon variants? Well, there was less than 10 Raichu decks, less than 10 Sylveon decks. And I believe one of those decks, one Raichu and one Sylveon made day two. So you're looking at about if you one or two decks make top 64, you're looking at about 20% of those decks making the next day. So there's a little noise in the data that way, but let's keep looking through the data to see this next level of detail, which I think is important. Golisopod Zoroark made a huge resurgence. 17% of the people who brought Golisopod Zoroark made day 2. And when you look at that, Golisopod Zoroark, there was 65 people who brought Golisopod Zoroark to Collinsville. So for almost 20% of them to make day 2, to make top 64, that's pretty remarkable. Same thing with Buzzwole. About 17% of people who brought Buzzwole made it to top 64. Lycanroc Zoroark, about 15% conversion rate. So again, this data is just given to you, so that you can see, here's the day 1 meta share, and then as we look at day 2, what deck could I maybe bring to think about, do I have a good shot at doing well with this deck? Are other people doing well with this deck? Am I going to make top 64 if I bring, this sort of variant? Look at the bottom end of the scale. Some of the decks that made a bit of a splash, but their conversion rates maybe weren't what we would have expected. So Gardevoir getting a lot of hype before the tournament, only 2% conversion rate. If we look at Gardevoir with Zoroark, 6% conversion rate. So any Gardevoir variant, the conversion rate was about 4 or 5%. It's pretty low when you consider the top 64 decks that only 4 or 5% of them, of the people who brought a Gardevoir variant, made top 64. Volcanion was another deck that to me was a little surprising to see a Volcanion make top 8, no less than top 64. But only 3% of Volcanion players made top 64 with their deck. Espeon Garb was another deck that was kind of getting some rumblings before the tournament, and a good amount of the player base brought Espeon Garb, about a 4% conversion rate there. So you can look at this data as well. The last piece of data I want to cover is this slide, which shows you of the number of players that brought a certain deck, how many made to day 2. So these are decks that had a conversion rate of less than 4%. I'm trying to remember the filter I put on here. So if these decks had a less than 4% conversion rate, that tells me that these decks aren't very good. So what am I trying to say here? Any deck that had less than a 4% conversion rate will show up on this slide. So this slide will show you on the left-hand side how many people took the deck to Collinsville. So Magnezone, the first one on the left, about 110 people, or about 102 people took the deck to Collinsville. The number on top of the bar then shows how many people advanced to top 64. So of the 102 Magnezone players, zero got to top 64. When you look at Tapu Bulu Vikavolt, of the 85 or so Bulu players, 4 made it to top 64. So these conversion rates, personally, they're just my opinion, these conversion rates are dreadful. I don't know that these decks are that great. I'll give you an example. Magnezone, for 105 players to take it, and for none of them to get lucky enough through the course of 9 rounds to just have one of them luck their way into top 64, tells me that the deck itself has real problems. I don't think Magnezone is a good deck at all. I strictly think it's a worse version of Vikavolt. The problem you have with Magnezone compared to Bulu Vikavolt is your damage cap is a little higher, but your energy and your resources, which is always the limiting resource in either Bulu or Magnezone, is always how much energy can you keep on the board, how much energy can you get on the board. In Magnezone, you have to do one extra step, which is to get those energies out of the deck. In Bulu, as soon as you get the turn 2 Vikavolt, you have access to your energy. You can get into your deck and get it into your active spot. With Magnezone, you can't do that. You have to be able to set up turn 2 or turn 3 Magnezone, and then you still have to draw into all your energies and put them on the board. And then you have to have a way to get the recovery out of the discard pile into the deck, and then another way to get them out of the deck and onto the board. So those are extra steps that I just think makes the deck very inconsistent and not a good play. So the other decks to look at here that might be telling is, Greninja had almost 60 players bring it to Collinsville. Only 2 of them made day 2. Ho-Oh had 40 or 50 players. Only 2 of them made day 2. So again, all of these conversion rates are really low. These are decks that I look at and I'm probably going to shy away from. You could maybe argue that some of the decks on the far right hand side, you know, maybe like in Lowland Ninetales, Decidueye, Bulu Silvally, that maybe some of these decks just didn't have great representation. So, you know, the fact that 5 people brought it and none of them made top 64, okay, I can understand the point there. But it really raises an eyebrow when 105 people bring a deck like Magnezone, Duskmane, Necrozma, and none of them advance to day 2. That just makes me shake my head at that deck. So the last thing I want to leave you guys with is just a resource that you can use to get some decks and to get some information on tournament results. I always use this site. I think it's a great site. There's a lot of great resources on here. It's limitlesstcg.com. So if you migrate over to the tournament section of the site, you can click on any of the recent tournaments we've had, and then if a deck list has been posted anywhere, and for top 64 at Collinsville, Arcanine Labs actually posted all of those lists, but there's a list of all the top 64 decks here on Limitless TCG, and you can go ahead and take a look. Actually, I think Arcanine only posted the top 44, however many people advanced to day 2. But you can take a look. If anybody shared their deck list anywhere, then Limitless TCG will pick it up and load it to their site, and you can go ahead and check if they have it. So if you want to see Alex Hill's 3rd place Buzzwole Lycanroc list, you've got it here on Limitless. You can actually click Export to PTCGO, copy this, and then bring it right into PTCGO for some games if you want to just, you know, throw a deck into PTCGO and play a few games with them. So I think it's a great resource. Again, that's limitlesstcg.com. Go ahead and mess around with some of the decks that did well at Collinsville Regional, and best of luck to you in your League Cups, and if you're going to Charlotte, best of luck there as well. Thanks for watching Deaddrawgaming's YouTube channel, and have a great day.